What's up, gamers? Welcome back to 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and today I'm going to talk about bonus sheets and how those relate to Cube Draft. This is kind of an obscure topic in the world of Cube, but if you are a fan of Retail Limited, you've likely heard of bonus sheets. Bonus sheets are an extra list of cards that are not in the main set, but they tend to appear at one per booster pack when you are cracking packs and drafting them. And this is a concept that I experimented a little bit with last year in Cube Draft. I actually wrote an article. This is one of the last articles I wrote about Cube for StarCityGames.com. At the time, I was cubing weekly on a stream with some friends on what was called the We Will Be Cubing stream. Sadly, that is a defunct project now, but that was a lot of fun. And bonus sheets were something that I used to try to add some consistency to drafts just to make sure that while we were playing games and streaming, our decks generally function. So I was trying to pad the functionality of our decks. So the bonus sheet were some extra cards where we would all always have access to them. I did it a little bit differently than how you would see a bonus sheet in a retail limited environment. I'm going to link the article that I wrote about that, and I'll touch more on how I had tried to implement some concept of a bonus sheet. But first, let's talk a little bit more about bonus sheets and how they exist in retail limited. The first ever bonus sheet in Magic released with Time Spiral way back in 2006. It's something that didn't get used a lot since then until more recently, but the bonus sheet for Time Spiral was called the Time Shifted sheet. And what that was, it was a selection of cards from all of Magic's history that were reprinted into Standard. Now, when it comes to more recent bonus sheets, this is more a tool that Wizards uses to reprint cards outside of a set, and so the printing there, the reprinting for bonus sheets, does not necessarily impact a card's legality. So the Time Spiral sheet was kind of a weird exception where all the cards had to be standard legal, and they were also showing off a lot of Magic's histories, a lot of oddballs. So there would be weird cards that they wouldn't necessarily print today, but not things that were so extreme that they would be ruinous to standard. So you see a lot of funny cards on the bonus sheet. Things like Psionic Blast, a 3-mana blue card that deals damage that really doesn't fall into blue's color pie at all. And a lot of what was happening in Time Spiral was playing with the color pie. And you see some weirdos like Darkness from Legends, which is just a black fog, just a 1-mana black instant that prevents all combat damage that turn, which is so not a black effect, but it's something you can kind of justify playing a little bit with color pie expression. And so the Time Spiral sheet was really weird and eclectic. It was this range of cards that were more to showcase that weirdness and just how many different places Magic has been in the past than to really have any kind of central theme. It was just like 100 some extra cards, and it was really cool. It added a lot of diversity to that standard and to that limited environment. And I was at an age where I could really appreciate seeing some of these cards for the first time, exploring more of the history of Magic, and also I really liked that I was opening an extra rare in a lot of my booster packs. That's stuff that I have less appreciation for now that I kind of just know most of the older cards and I don't really care about opening rares and booster packs. But I do think that the recent examples of bonus sheets do give some food for thought for Cube Draft. There's some cool stuff going on here. I specifically want to talk about the Wilds of Eldraine bonus sheet called Enchanting Tales. This bonus sheet consisted entirely of a spread of different enchantments from Magic's history, and a range of power levels here too. And again, these were not printed into standard, these were just kind of fancy reprints. So there's some amount of reprinting cards that's harder to find space to reprint without putting them into constructed formats, yada yada. For the most part though, why Enchanting Tales really captured my attention and imagination is that having an enchantment in every booster pack, a reminder, the bonus sheet, there's going to be one card from the bonus sheet in every booster pack that allows you to just have a high volume of this card type. If every card on the bonus sheet's an enchantment, and there's a card from the bonus sheet in every pack, there's at least one enchantment in every pack. And where that really showed up in Wilds of Eldraine was with a mechanic called Bargain. Bargain is a mechanic that lets you get some extra value if you sacrifice something. You can sacrifice a couple different things. You can sacrifice an artifact, a token, or an enchantment. So there's other stuff you could sacrifice. But having a very high volume of enchantments just in the retail limited environment by virtue of the bonus sheet did power up that mechanic. And specifically, I liked the weaker cards on the bonus sheet for this, or maybe less weaker cards, but also some of the aspirational cards on the bonus sheet. Some of the stuff on the sheet is just really strong. There's cards like Forced Fruition, where if you cast that, it's pretty likely your opponent's going to deck, or at least that's the idea when you cast it. So it's a rare that can kind of win the game more or less on its own without a terrible amount of support. That's the stuff that I don't really love on the bonus sheet. I like the bonus sheet introducing modest weirdos. Specifically, there's a few different enchantments on the Enchanting Tales bonus sheet that mostly just draw a card. Dragon Mantle is a red aura for 1 mana. Enchanted creature gets fire breathing, and when it enters, you draw a card. You have Ground Seal, which is kind of a weirdo. It's a 2 mana green enchantment. It says cards in graveyards can't be the target of spells or abilities. Questionable whether that's going to be a factor of retail limited or in a given game of limited, but when it enters, it draws a card. I love that Spreading Seas is on the Enchanted Tales bonus sheet. 2 mana blue aura enchants a land. That land becomes an island, and when it enters, you draw a card. That was one that was a little bit powerful the last time it was in Standard with the original printing in Zendikar. It could show up in some different Standard formats. It's one that's not very fun. I understand why you wouldn't necessarily want to print it in a Standard, whatever. But I like it specifically being on the bonus sheet because it already did its job. You drew a card. You're probably not going to mess with your opponent's mana too much in Limited, though it can come up, so it's kind of a fun aspect too. But it's a really kind of free card to bargain. It already replaces itself, and so it plays with this enchantments matter mechanic, and just anything else that cares about enchantments in the environment too is going to play really well with all these cards. I specifically love Hatching Plans. This is more of a weirdo, it's a little bit more aspirational, and what it does is really powerful when it works, so maybe it's something that's getting kind of into that bomb rare territory, but it's just a 2 mana enchantment, and when it goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, you draw 3 cards. So a great enchantment to bargain. You do have to draft draw it a little bit, so it is more fun than a card like Force Fruition, because you're not just putting it in your deck because it's strong. You do have to make sure you can consistently bargain it or put it to the graveyard by some other means. So it's a little bit more of a build around. It's kind of a funky card. And I just kind of love all these weirdos that kind of play with the theme. That, Hatching Plans, again, you can kind of build your deck around. Maybe that one's on the powerful side if it works too consistently. But all these cards with kind of marginal effects that definitely play in the environment, that's the kind of stuff that really appeals to me for something like a bonus sheet to try to use that kind of thing in a cube draft environment. And if you want to implement a bonus sheet the way that they do it in Retail Limited, it's pretty easy. You do kind of have to separate all of your bonus sheet cards, which I think it's not too difficult. You can mark the card on an inner or an outer sleeve to designate that it's on the bonus sheet. You can use some kind of weird treatment. Like, for example, doing literal Enchanted Tales, all the cards have this frame that's very easily identified. You could do something like that to make it really easy to separate the cards out. But then when you're drafting, you make your packs, and then you just put a card from the bonus sheet into every pack. And I know that a lot of players do collate their cubes. Certainly, players that do play more in the set cube kind of space, where you have a set amount of commons, uncommons, you want to really only have one rare per pack. Then it's just a little bit more of the same. You then add a card from the bonus sheet on top of that collation. But it's really easy to do this if you're not collating at all. If your cube is just fully randomized otherwise, you shuffle up, you just add one card from the bonus sheet. It's not that hard to have a stack of cards you separate out at the end of every draft, and if you mark it somehow and players are aware of it, usually players will go ahead and separate that out for you. You already have to do that with basic lands, so it's not like there's that much extra going on, and it's not that difficult to keep track of. I think it's less a question of how easy it is to implement a bonus sheet, and more a question of, does this concept excite you? Is there something you would want to try? Is there a reason you want to implement this into your cube? So I'm going to talk about a couple reasons why you might want to do that. The first is just really basic. You want more mana fixing. We love it when our decks work. We hate it when we're mana screwed. And that's really a lot of what I was doing with my implementation of bonus sheets, which again is a little bit different to what I did than adding a card to a pack. I'll get into that in a little bit. but just adding some mana fixing lands on a bonus sheet, and usually you would want them to be weaker than the really sought after, because these are for sure going to be in a pack. If you're playing at a cube size where you're not drafting all the cards, then it makes kind of sense to have kind of a lower power level smoothing lands. Things like temples I really like if you're at a lower power level, and certainly if you want to do a mechanic where a land type matters, guild gates really work for a bonus sheet. I mean, it's pretty close to just what they have done in some Ravnica sets, where you get a guild gate either in every pack or every other pack. And the Enchanting Tales example, getting some lower power enchantments if you want to do an enchantment theme, but you have some stuff where it's like, do I really want to put Ground Seal in my cube? Well, if it's not taking the slot, if it's just extra, if you're drafting 15 card packs and you have the bonus sheet, and it's not part of the main cube, so it doesn't take a slot in curating the main cube, and also it's just a 16th card in the pack, you can do it that way. It doesn't take away from anything, it is just a bonus. Then it's pretty nice to add that padding there. If you do like Metalcraft, Artifacts Matter, tossing things like artifact lands, those are kind of contentious, at least in my mind when I'm curating an artifact-heavy environment. I want Seed of the Synod in my decks generally, but it's hard to make a lot of space for that kind of thing in the cube. It doesn't fix your mana, and especially when I play in artifact environments, I expect and I personally include in my cubes some amount of interaction, some shatters. You want to be able to destroy artifacts if that's a lot of what's going on in the environment, and then it really sucks if you play an artifact land, you get Stone Rained on turn 1 or 2. Your opponent uses a shatter and just destroys your land. So the bridges, the tap cycle from Modern Horizons that are indestructible and produce 2 colors, there's just more going on there. You're happy to draft them, happy to put them in your deck, easy to make room for them in the cube, where there's more baggage with just the destructible monocolor artifact lands. And there's plenty you can do in the artifact space that's reminiscent of what I like about Enchanting Tales. There's all kinds of dumpy artifacts that cantrip or give you some small effect, but are not super exciting to put into a cube. And also, with the way that artifacts tend to operate on volume, you're often happy to have an Ornithopter in your deck with Cranial Plating or Mox Opal, like any kind of threshold effect for artifacts. But they're less exciting, they only work in so many decks, and then how many of these zeros do you want? If you have an environment where a player would want multiple Ornithopters or multiple players would be interested in artifacts like that, are they going to want Phyrexian Walker? 0 mana 0/3 that doesn't have flying, doesn't natively have any power, Memnite 0 mana 1/1. Those cards are a little bit more questionable than Ornithopter. So then just being able to slot them on something like a bonus sheet where it's just extra, it's easier to put some cards that are kind of more weirdos that you don't think are exciting, that won't necessarily make decks, but can increase the volume of things that your cube kind of needs to function. So like trinkety artifacts, mopey enchantments, mana fixing lands, these things all make a lot of sense to me in this space. Another idea that came to me while I was writing my outline for this episode is you could do something really similar to the Time Spiral Time Shifted sheet for your cube. Let me explain. When it comes to cutting cards from cube, I personally am somebody who's usually happy to see the new cards, to get some stuff that's not working as well out, and to move the cube over time closer to my vision. And I'm not talking about just like putting in stronger effects and making the cube more powerful every time. At a point, I get to a place where I'm happy with the play environment, and I'm not necessarily interested in turning my Psychotog into Psychic Frog. I still have Psychotog in Spooky Cube, that's where I want the cube to be. But over time, some things do need to be cut. And I know that a lot of other players find themselves more sentimental, have more difficulty cutting cards, or they miss cards that they have cut. Maybe you have them sitting around in a box. Maybe you keep them with your cube. You just have this stack of cards that are the cards that have sadly been removed from your cube. And that is something you could really easily just turn into a version of the Time Spiral Time Shifted sheet. You just take that stack of cards, mark them in some way, or you'll know what they are, and just add them. Just add an extra card that's no longer fitting your cube exactly, or no longer strong enough by some metrics, that wasn't making decks, and you were sad you had to cut it. Just toss it in as an extra card. Just put it in packs, put it as a 16th card in packs on a bonus sheet, and if you do that, it'll show up in decks sometimes, and it doesn't actually really cost you anything with your main cube. You just have it along, it's extra, it's a bonus. So that's something that I personally haven't done, but it was really fun when they did it in Time Spiral, and I have a feeling that that's going to appeal to some cube designers. So I did want to toss that one out there as something that you could personally experiment with. All right, now let's talk about the type of bonus sheets, and specifically the implementation that I have tried. I was using these for Tuberts, and when I draft with 4, that's what we'll be doing on the We Will Be Cubing stream, we draft 5 packs of 9. Adding 5 cards from a bonus sheet is kind of a lot more, especially when you consider the size of a Tubert being 180 cards. So what I did, I wanted to get some more mana fixing and give players a little bit more leeway and getting maybe 1 or 2 more playable spells, but not the strongest cards in the cube, just kind of replacement level stuff. So what I landed on was coming up with lists of 30 cards that had just 1 cycle of mana fixing, a couple spells from every monocolor that were a little bit below rate for what else is going on in the cube, a couple artifacts of a similar texture, and maybe 1 or 2 lands that weren't part of a cycle, something like Fabled Passage, that is a 5-color fixing land, but is not as strong as Prismatic Vista or City of Brass, just other options in the space. What we would do then is after the regular draft, we would do a snake draft, and everybody would end up with 3 cards off of that 30-card sheet. So we'd use 12 of them off of the sheet, and the idea is that hopefully everybody would land on the same number that would go into their deck. I didn't want it to be the case that somebody plays all 3 and is pretty happy about it, and somebody plays 1. I wanted it to be the case where there weren't these really exciting cards, and there weren't cards that would define the draft. So the land cycle in the original recipe Tubert, it was just those temples, just lands that enter tapped, tap for 1 or 2 colors and scry 1. They're fine, they're good. When you're a 3-color deck, then you're ideally just trying to get 3 of those. And the idea of the monocolor spells is they would help round out somebody that maybe is fighting somebody else in the same color pair for a temple, or just would end up possibly in somebody's deck that conceptually could add as much to a 2-color deck as a temple adds to a 3-color deck, because it is a cost for your lands to enter tapped. The balance might not have been perfect, but the concept tend to work week to week. It typically was the case where we would all play about 2 of them, and it never felt like somebody was getting away with something and just getting the most cards off of the bonus sheet. So it worked fine for that purpose. I had one constructed for the original recipe Tubert and one for the Tempo Tubert. The Tempo Tubert was kind of funny because I had a lot of spells that just kind of weren't strong enough for the cube, and there was one that really stood out. There was always a fight. Whoever got the first pick would often pick the card Shock, which is weaker than every red removal spell in the cube, but it's still totally playable. It still kills most of the creatures in the cube, so it's still great for fighting the attrition battles, even if it's not the best burn card to go upstairs. So that one was one that I always thought it was kind of charming that people would be excited about Shock when they already had Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning in their deck. Maybe it wasn't the best implementation of the balance of this kind of thing, but it was always fun to think about and joke about. And then I also did something similar with my Vintage Cube, and I had this scaled all the way up for 8-player drafts, where I removed a lot of the mana fixing lands from the cube. I know I kept fetch lands in the main cube and like ABU duels and I think shock lands, surveil lands. And I had it so you had to actually draft the lands that were really high picks in the environment. And then I had things like creature duels, things like fast lands, buddy lands, and then I also went out of my way to find 3 different monocolor options for every color, just so it wasn't the case that somebody would always be getting a bunch of good lands for a 5-color deck or a 3-color deck. If you did draft Boros or Mono Red, I wanted you to still get something, so I did the same thing where I laid that sheet out. And I think that at the peak of how many cards I had on my Vintage Cube land bonus sheet, I had like 90 or 100 cards. And it was the kind of thing where you do 8 players and you did the snake draft, so 24 total cards were drafted off of it. And I wanted to have enough options where there would be some amount of contention on some of the color pairs, but then you still had another option. If somebody took your Creeping Tar Pit, you could still get Dark Slick Shores, And if you were just mono blue, I had stuff like Talaria West, and it's some weirdo colorless cards. Some of stuff kind of similar to what I was talking about with the time shifted sheet and using that as a bonus sheet. I had like Rashad Port that isn't that strong in Vintage Cube anymore, but if you got it for free at the end of the draft, you would play it in some decks. And then I had Dust Bowl there too because it's a cool card. I could put it there. And I think I had like Maze of Ith, which is just kind of not close to good enough in Vintage Cube anymore. But if you picked up the Maze of Ith and the Urborg off the bonus sheet, maybe you could really be doing it. I don't know. So it was just kind of this thing where I got to put more powerful cards in the cube so that I used fewer slots on lands so I could fit in more diversity of spells while still keeping the list tight. And then also just made it so at the end of the draft, everybody would get a little bit more opportunity to play Magic. In general, players would still be playing multiple colors because you still had fetch dual shock in the cube. It wasn't like you could rely on this and then suddenly you would pick up 3 lands off the bonus sheet and play a 5-color deck. It was something that would just help you round out what you were already drafting, and it was just kind of a quality of life improvement thing. And in terms of adding a little consistency, this was a really useful tool. But then something happened when we stopped doing the We Will Be Cubing stream. I remember there was a few weeks after that, where I showed up at the LGS and was getting a draft together with 4 players for the Tempo Tubert. And I had the bonus sheet, and I just found myself needing to describe it to somebody who had never used it before, and it just felt like so much to talk about and just this extra stuff where it's like, man, I just want to draft and start playing games. So this relates to last week's topic when I talked about familiarity as a cube design tool. And something I didn't talk about then, something that is an extra barrier to familiarity, is any amount of house rules in your cube, anything you do that's out of the ordinary, anything that's an extra layer of friction between knowing how to open 3 booster packs and draft a retail limited deck and how to draft your cube, is just something that can make players less familiar. It's more that you have to explain to them. And this is kind of weird to do that snake draft at the end. And it was the kind of thing where I also felt like, certainly when I had my vintage cube at like a bonus sheet with 90 lands, and I knew all of them, I would lay those out after a draft. And I also just kind of feel myself as I laid them out, just thinking like, do people even know what all of these are? There's not enough time to read all this stuff. So we're just like doing face-up rotisserie drafts of the land so everybody can see what's there, what's being taken. It's not like drafting out of a pack. And it just felt cumbersome. I felt like I was bogging the cube down to the extent that I was making decks a little bit more consistent and players able to cast their spells a little bit more often in the game, making it so that players were generally happily playing as many spells as they want to be playing, generally a little bit happier with their decks when executed properly. I do think that it was adding too much extra explanation and extra process to drafting, and I ultimately have decided that the juice has not been worth the squeeze for me. When we were playing weekly with the same people, when it was just the same 4 people on the We Will Be Cubing stream and we all knew what was going on in the bonus sheets, once you get that familiarity, this can be a nice tool. It can smooth things over. Ultimately, though, I have been revisiting all of these designs and just trying to make things a little bit smoother in the cube list itself so that I don't have to rely on this tool that is unfamiliar to a lot of players and is extra steps. And I'm specifically talking about the laying the entire bonus sheet snake draft after the draft aspect. If you want to just add cards, 1 bonus sheet card per pack to a draft, that's super approachable. You hardly have to explain anything. You might even just be fine not even saying anything. Like people open a 16 card pack, or maybe they see you adding a 16th card from a bonus sheet to a pack. It doesn't really change anything at any kind of fundamental level. So that's a lot easier to implement than drafting these sheets face up. But I do want to talk about that because it is something that possibly other players would be interested in. Maybe it's something that could work for one of your designs. Maybe you have like a list where you want to get a little bit more going on, and like that snake draft where everybody will have options for up to 3 cards and you have a range of appealing effects, or just at a baseline decent mana fixing, decent spells that can kind of smooth things over. If you always find yourself 1 land shy and 1 spell short, this could be a tool that's worth exploring for you. But for my purposes, I have moved away. I no longer use these for any of my tuberts. And for the vintage cube, this was something that I was experimenting with, trying to get down to a 180 card vintage cube, a 5-color vintage tubert. And it's just been so hard to make it so that green is appealing, because green either relies on you needing to like fast bond and play extra lands, or going to that land space, or doing something with Gaia's Cradle. Like, those are a couple of the marquee power outliers for green that can make it hang in a high power environment. But then once you have such a tight list, if you have an 180 card vintage cube, you just see power so much more often. You're just going to have Moxen in every deck. 1 in 4 players is going to have Black Lotus, and it just becomes harder to fit that green stuff into. I haven't been able to crack it. The idea was by putting a bunch of mana fixing lands on the bonus sheet and getting more cards in the cube, that meant I could add more green and white cards. It opens up space where you can have enough green cards. You can pitch cast Endurance or Force of Vigor, white cards to pitch cast Solitude, and so you can get some of those staples to start to matter as you get a higher volume of them. But it was still just the case that even if I added like a bunch of mana dorks, or I had like a Nadu package, it was some combination of really parasitic and not powerful enough, and I just haven't really been able to make it work in a 5-color 180 card environment. And so actually more recently I have updated my list for the powered Grixis Tubert. So the current state, for those interested, of my powered Tubert, I have a 180 card powered Grixis Tubert, and that one is just drafted straight up, and it's a lot easier to fit mana fixing for 3 colors. I don't have to stress about like green not being very appealing, and white is also kind of hard once you're not doing like a volume of aggressive creatures. It's something you'll notice if you've ever done like the Supreme draft of Vintage Cube and Magic Online, or right now they have the no holds barred Vintage Cube draft going, where everything is just a little bit higher. They have some weirdos like Gleamox, where there's an extra Mox in the cube. And as the power level does skew higher, which does happen as your powered cube list gets tighter because it gets smaller, it becomes a lot harder to draft things like Boros. People have talked about like, oh yeah, Boros is so strong, Johnny MH3, and like that's not all of what's going on there. It's also just the case that as the cube gets larger, creatures with power and toughness become more naturally appealing. You don't see as much of the Tinker stuff, as much of the totally broken stuff. When somebody is time vaulting you, getting the initiative and attacking for 12 on turn 3 is not good enough. So it's worth noting that as you try to whittle down to the most powerful cards in all of Magic, the Boros cards still barely rank. Like, they're marginally competitive, but those decks can only really hang if they are reasonably interactive, where at the 540 card cubes, when you're cutting out stuff like Time Vault, it just becomes easier, especially if you have the redundancy of just creatures with power and toughness, which is kind of naturally a way that players do fill out these cube lists, something I talked about in my assessment of the Arena Powered Cube. But anyway, getting pretty deep about powered cubes, let's get back to talking about bonus sheets. The important thing that I want to stress today is not how I have tried to do this and whether or not this has worked for me, but just to offer this as a potential tool for you as a cube designer. This is something I definitely wanted to publish. The idea of why I wanted to tackle bonus sheets as a topic on the podcast is because I have bonus sheets still listed on the original recipe Tubert and the Tempo Tubert on my Cube Cobra page, and so now and again I'll get a question about what's going on with those, and kind of a funny thing happened where I had mutagenic growth on the Tempo Tubert bonus sheet and kind of forgot about that, and I was moving some stuff around recently, getting Monstrous Rage in there and making the cube a little bit less about drawing extra cards, a little bit more like big hits in combat. And I added mutagenic growth to the main cube, and somebody replied on there like, so are there 2 mutagenic growths on the cube now, or what's going on with the bonus sheet and the main cube mutagenic growth there? And I was like, oh, well, I don't actually use the bonus sheet anymore, and I kind of forgot that that's where the copy that I added to the cube came from. So I did want to make a point to address this on the podcast here and kind of codify where I am at with bonus sheets. But more than that, I did want to float those ideas, things like Enchanting Tales, the way that appeals to me, the way you might be able to absorb some of that into your own designs, maybe some ideas for how you can experiment with mana fixing lands in your cubes, that time shifted idea of just adding some of your old favorites, even if you expect nobody to actually play them, just to have an extra card in the pack that's even just nice to look at, and maybe somebody will play. I think that idea is really cool. I hope that somebody runs with that one. And this is just another way of saying I really want to drive home. I don't want this podcast to be about me saying how everything should be done and why my ideas are good. It's important to talk about things that I tried that I maybe liked at first and why I like them and why I grew not to like them, but also just to float them as ideas. There's infinite ideas out there, there's infinite different configurations of how you can implement them, and ultimately, as I always say, your cube, your rules. So if there's something that you like here, I want to talk about all these things so that if you are hearing it for the first time, you can take the ball and run with it. And also, if you just have not experimented that much in the cube space, I do try to make my content approachable for players who have never heard of cube. That's actually the most important audience to me, is to get somebody who does not know what's going on in the space at all and start cubing for the first time, or somebody who has built one cube, and to open up the world for them and to show them just how many different things you can do in the world of cube. It's been so cool to see how many grassroots cube events have been taking off and how people are traveling a bit to play in these cube events. It's been really awesome to see, and there's been so much evolution in how players who are really invested think about cube and design cubes, but there's still people that we need to bring into the world of cube in the first place. And there's still people who we need to get from drafting just the Magic Online Vintage Cube and introduce them to the fact that both there are simple cubes you can build, you can do it, anybody can do it, and then once you start doing it, the range of possibilities is only limited by your imagination. So it doesn't matter what I like. What matters is what you like, what you have fun playing, and if you can dream it, you can do it. That's the beauty of cube. Self-expression, playing Magic the way that you want to play it, and sharing that with others. That's the thing that cube allows us to do, and that's what's so great about cube. And that's where I'm going to end things today. I think I kind of shared all of my thoughts and feelings on the topic. I'm feeling a little self-conscious because I've gone a bit longer than that on previous episodes. I kind of like the idea of a half-hour length, but I tend to be pretty long-winded. But I think I've said everything that I have to say about this. So let me know how you feel about the shorter podcast. This is a little bit more in line for the kind of podcast. About a half hour goes in line with how long of a walk I like to take when I listen to podcasts. So maybe this is the sweet spot for some other people. Let me know how you feel about that. Appreciate you taking the time to listen. Appreciate you liking, sharing, subscribing, whatever you do to support the podcast here. And I'll be back next week talking more cube. Later, gamers.